It was supposed to be a peaceful evening. My mother, recovering from heart surgery, was finally resting in the comfort of my home. But what happened next would change everything. As the ambulance rushed to save her life, something terrifying blocked the way, a massive black SUV, parked right in my driveway. And standing in the doorway, blocking my every move, was Deborah Williams, the HOA president, with a smirk on her face. "Move your car, Deborah, my mom can't breathe." I shouted, but what she said next, it stopped me cold. "Rules are rules," she sneered. "You should have followed them." Little did she know, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. What happened next would shock our entire community and reveal a secret about my mother that no one saw coming. Stay tuned, because you won't believe how this story ends. There's something about a quiet neighborhood, isn't there? The kind of place where people wave as they drive by, where you know your neighbors by name, and where life feels peaceful. You could sit on your front porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the rustling leaves in the trees, knowing that the world outside your little bubble is calm. But then something happens. A storm rolls in, not of rain or wind, but of the kind of tension that turns everything you once thought you understood upside down. This is the story of that kind of storm. For so many of us, our homes are more than just houses. They're havens, especially when it's family that we're taking care of. After years of supporting others, it was my turn to step in and take care of my mother. My mother, who had always been the one with all the answers, the one who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, had now come to a place where she needed help. She had just had major heart surgery, the kind of surgery that makes you think twice about what truly matters. I remember the day we brought her to my house, her face pale, her hands trembling from the medication. My heart broke for her as I helped her inside, a mix of guilt and worry clouding my mind. Was this too much? Was I doing enough? My mother, the woman who had spent her whole life taking care of others, now needed me, and I vowed, right there and then, that I would make sure she had everything she needed to recover. I promised her a peaceful, stress-free recovery, something she hadn't had in years. But life, as we know, has a funny way of challenging our plans. Across the street, standing with a clipboard and a smile that felt just a little too perfect, was Deborah Williams, the newly appointed HOA president. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, she was just another neighbor, right? But something about her presence made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way she looked at my house, like she was already judging the way I ran it. Maybe it was the way she nodded at my mother, sizing her up from afar. Her smile never reached her eyes. I had seen that kind of look before, a power trip in disguise. And from that moment, I knew life in this once peaceful neighborhood was about to change in ways I couldn't imagine. The next day, when I was helping my mom with her morning medication, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I answered with a slight sense of irritation. But standing there, clipboard in hand, was Deborah. "Good morning," she said, a tone of authority in her voice that immediately set me on edge. "I need to discuss your mother's stay here." I blinked in confusion. My mother had just gotten home from the hospital. She was still weak and barely able to sit up without assistance. "My mother's staying here, temporarily while she recovers." "She's my responsibility, Deborah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But Deborah wasn't hearing any of it. "According to HOA rules," she said, her voice rising slightly, "all new residents must be approved by the board. Your mother's stay here is in violation of Section 14.7 of the HOA bylaws, and those medical devices, they're not allowed." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "She's not a new resident," I countered. "She's family. She needs help recovering. This isn't about a rule. It's about caring for my mother." But Deborah, with that cold smile, just shrugged. "Rules are rules," she said. And just like that, it was clear. This wasn't about a policy. It was about control. As I watched her walk away, clipboard in hand, I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. My mother, my hero, the one who had always been there for me, now was being attacked by a woman who had never known true hardship, never known the pain of watching someone you love struggle to breathe. The emotional roller coaster had just begun, and I didn't know how I was going to keep it together. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from my neighbor Tom, who sat on the HOA board, popped up one after the other. Deborah's gone into full attack mode. She's already scheduled an emergency board meeting. One text read, "She's accusing your mom's medical equipment of damaging the neighborhood aesthetic." I couldn't believe it. This wasn't about my mother's health. This was about a petty HOA president trying to make a power play. As I sat down to absorb it all, I felt the crushing weight of helplessness. How could I fight this? How could I make Deborah see that what she was doing wasn't just wrong, it was cruel? That evening, Deborah and 2 other board members showed up at my door. My mother, exhausted from the day, was resting in her room, but I was furious. "Your unauthorized resident and all the medical equipment are in violation of HOA regulations," Deborah stated, trying to look like she was reading off some official document. "I'm sorry, but my mother is recovering from surgery," I said, trying to keep calm. "She's not a new resident, she's family. She needs help to recover, and I'm the one giving it to her. Please leave." Deborah's eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules," she said with a shrug. "You've been warned." Her dismissive attitude sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't about rules. This was about Deborah enforcing her authority at any cost, without any empathy or understanding. As the days went on, I could feel the tension building. More notices appeared on my door, demanding compliance with rules that were clearly designed for people who didn't have real, human lives to contend with. My phone pinged again and again, with neighbors gossiping and passing along Deborah's threats. I watched my mother's health deteriorate with each passing day. Her breathing became more labored, and the medication she was on made her feel weak and disoriented. Every day felt like a new battle, both with Deborah's relentless power trip and with the growing fear that I might lose my mother before I could fix everything. One night, as I helped her into bed, I noticed how pale she looked. Her face, usually full of warmth and strength, was drained. I covered her with a blanket, but I couldn't stop the wave of panic that washed over me. How much longer would we be able to endure this? Would Deborah continue to harass us while my mother fought for her life? I didn't know. And then it happened. The worst fear I had been holding inside me came true. That night, while I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, my mother suddenly started gasping for air. I rushed into the living room and found her clutching her chest, her face turning gray. My heart stopped. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "Please hurry. My mother can't breathe." "She's had heart surgery," I cried. As the dispatcher calmly assured me that help was on the way, I sprinted outside to guide the ambulance in. But when I reached the driveway, I froze. Deborah's brand new SUV was parked sideways, blocking the entire entrance to my home. I ran to Deborah's house, my heart racing. "Deborah!" I shouted, banging on her door. "Your car is blocking my driveway. My mother needs help now." Deborah, wearing a bathrobe and curlers, opened the door slowly. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she hissed. "This is a private community, and you can't just park an ambulance here without prior approval." I stared at her in disbelief. "This is an emergency. My mother is inside. She can't breathe." But Deborah stood there, arms crossed, her face cold. "I'm following the rules," she said, not a hint of concern in her voice. "It's in the bylaws. I'm documenting this." I felt a wave of desperation. Every second mattered, and Deborah was standing in my way, blocking my mother's chance for survival. As the minutes ticked by, my heart felt like it was being ripped out of my chest. I had just spoken with the dispatcher, and the ambulance was on its way, but I couldn't shake the fear that I was running out of time. My mother's breaths were getting more labored, shallow, and desperate. I had never seen her like this before. The woman who had always been strong, always kept things together, was now gasping for air in front of me. I felt utterly helpless. I ran back inside, my hand shaking as I tried to get her into a more comfortable position. "Mom, just breathe, okay? The ambulance is coming. They'll be here soon," I reassured her, trying to sound calm. But in the pit of my stomach, I was terrified. Every breath she took seemed to rattle her body, and the oxygen machine beeped erratically. Her skin had turned pale, almost ghostly, and a dark purple tint was starting to form on her lips. I needed her to hold on, but the weight of the situation, the oppressive feeling of time slipping away, was suffocating me. I tried to keep together, for her, for me, for everything that mattered. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a medical emergency. This was a battle against time, against Deborah's apathy, against a system that failed to understand what it meant to be human. In those moments, I questioned everything. Was I doing enough? Was I being strong enough for her? I was supposed to be her rock, and yet here I was, watching her struggle and feeling powerless. The emotional toll of the situation weighed heavily on me, and I realized that in life, sometimes we're faced with moments so intense that they shake the very foundation of who we are. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the distant sound of sirens. My heart skipped a beat. Help was on the way. I rushed outside to guide the ambulance, relief flooding my veins. But as I reached the front yard, the sight that greeted me nearly stopped me in my tracks. Deborah's brand new black SUV, her pride and joy, was parked sideways in the driveway. My stomach dropped. The paramedics wouldn't be able to get to us. The driveway was the only clear path to the front door, and Deborah had blocked it. Was this a mistake? Was she unaware that there was an emergency? Or was this deliberate? I rushed to the street, waving my arms frantically at the ambulance, trying to make them understand that they needed to park further down the road. But as I glanced back at Deborah's house, I saw her silhouette standing in the doorway, a smug look on her face, arms crossed like she was watching a performance. I ran over to her house, my anger burning bright. My mother was inside, fighting for her life, and Deborah was playing power games. I pounded on her door, not caring about her precious rules anymore. "Move your car, Deborah. This is an emergency. My mother's dying." Deborah opened the door, wearing a bathrobe, looking completely unfazed. "Do you know what time it is?" she hissed, eyes narrowing. "This is private property. Emergency vehicles need prior approval. It's in the bylaws." I was stunned. Her coldness, her complete lack of empathy, took my breath away. How could she stand there, blocking an ambulance, while my mother was struggling for every breath? I felt my blood boil. This wasn't just about rules. This was about a human life. And in that moment, I wasn't going to let Deborah's obsession with control take my mother's life. It wasn't just that Deborah was blocking the driveway. It was the way she stood there, reveling in the power she thought she had. She didn't flinch. She didn't budge. She didn't care about the desperation in my voice or the panic in my eyes. To her, it was all about the rules. "I'm just enforcing the community standards," she said coldly. "You should have followed the rules. You know the HOA bylaws." But the truth was, this was never about bylaws. This was about a woman who had let power consume her. Deborah had built her entire life around the idea of control. She had the power to make people comply, to impose her will on others, and she loved it. But in her relentless pursuit of keeping things orderly, she had forgotten the one thing that mattered: humanity. My mother, a woman who had dedicated her life to serving others, was fighting for air in the back of an ambulance, and this woman, Deborah, was standing in my way. Deborah wasn't just a bureaucrat enforcing rules. She was a bully, using her position to hurt those who couldn't fight back. And that was the lesson that hit me like a punch in the stomach. Power, when used recklessly, doesn't protect, it destroys. It destroys relationships. It destroys lives. And most of all, it destroys compassion. In the middle of all the chaos, I found myself reaching for my phone. Desperate, I called my old friend, Mike, a retired officer from the local police department. "Mike, I need help," I said, voice shaking. "Deborah's blocking the ambulance. She's not moving her car. My mother, she's fighting for her life." Mike, who had known me since I was a child, didn't hesitate. "Stay put. I'm on my way," he said. As I waited for Mike's arrival, I realized something. In moments of crisis, we often look for heroes. But sometimes heroes aren't the ones we expect. They're not always the ones in uniform or the ones we think of as strong. Sometimes heroes are the people who show up when it matters most, the ones who stand by you when the world feels like it's falling apart. In this case, Mike was that hero. He understood the weight of the situation, and he knew how to handle people like Deborah, people who abused their positions of power. He didn't need to make a grand speech. He just needed to show up, and that was enough to change everything. And in that moment, I realized we don't always have control over the situations we face, but we can control who we surround ourselves with. We can find strength in others when we feel weak, and sometimes that's all it takes to turn the tide. As the ambulance finally pulled up, I turned to Deborah one last time. "Move your car now. My mother is dying," I shouted. Deborah didn't move. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching as the paramedics struggled to wheel the stretcher around her SUV. Her eyes flicked between the ambulance and me, her lips curling into a smirk. She was enjoying this, wasn't she? I felt a wave of anger flood through me, and for a moment I almost lost control. But then I remembered my mom, her fragile, pale face, her body fighting for breath. I took a deep breath and turned back to the paramedics. "We need to get her inside now," I said, trying to steady my shaking hands. The paramedics glanced at each other. "We're going to have to carry her," one of them said. "This isn't ideal, but we don't have a choice." I looked back at Deborah, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. She knew she was in the wrong, but she refused to admit it. I wasn't going to let her win. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. Every minute that Deborah stood there, arms crossed, smugly enforcing her rules, I could see my mother's condition deteriorating. The paramedics were struggling to navigate the stretcher through the neighbor's yard, trying to avoid sprinkler heads and potholes, all while losing precious time. I could feel my heart racing, my frustration boiling over. It wasn't just about the ambulance anymore. It was about my mom's life. I was standing there, helpless, watching as time slipped away with every delay, every moment of indecision from Deborah. My voice cracked as I turned to the paramedics, who were now dealing with the increasing difficulty of getting my mother to the ambulance. "Can't you just move her car?" I begged one of them, but he shook his head. "We don't have time. We're going to have to carry her." He paused and added, "But it's going to take longer with every second we lose." That's when something inside me snapped. I walked right up to Deborah, my anger rising in waves. "Enough is enough," I said, my voice sharp and trembling with emotion. "My mother is not a violation. She's a person, and you will not take her life for the sake of your damn rules." For the first time, Deborah's facade cracked. I could see the tiniest flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but she didn't move. She didn't even blink. It was as though she couldn't comprehend the consequences of her actions. I realized in that moment that this wasn't about rules. This was about power, control, and the callousness that can come when we let authority go unchecked. But that wasn't going to be enough to stop me. I wasn't going to let Deborah's tyranny win, not when my mother's life was hanging in the balance. As the paramedics carefully maneuvered my mother's stretcher through the yard, she suddenly, weakly, lifted her hand. She was struggling to speak, but I could see the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Mom." I whispered, rushing to her side. "Get my purse," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. "There's something you need to show her." I was confused for a moment, but then it hit me, her purse. I grabbed it quickly and rifled through it, not knowing what I was looking for. But then I found it. It was a badge, a gold police badge, the same one I had seen so many times growing up, but had completely forgotten about. My mother wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just a mother, a nurse, or a wife. She was the chief of police, the highest-ranking officer in the city. I froze. My heart pounded. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a full-blown revelation. As I stood there, staring at the badge in my hands, I realized something that shook me to my core. Deborah wasn't just blocking my mother's medical emergency. She had unknowingly stepped into a storm that she couldn't possibly weather. I walked back over to Deborah's house, the badge clutched tightly in my hand, my voice steady as I approached her front door. This was the turning point. This was where everything changed. When Deborah opened the door, I didn't say a word at first. I simply held up the badge. Her eyes went wide when she saw it gleaming in the light. Her smug expression faltered, and for the first time I saw fear in her eyes. "Do you know who this is?" I asked, my voice cold, controlled, and full of authority. "This is Chief Sandra Martinez, the same Sandra Martinez whose medical emergency you decided to block. Now, I suggest you think carefully about your next move, because you just made a serious mistake." Deborah's face drained of color as she took a step back. The once confident woman, who had made it her mission to enforce the rules, now looked like a child caught doing something wrong. Her arms dropped to her sides, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could feel a surge of relief wash over me. It was like I had unlocked the door to a new chapter of this fight. Deborah's powers were built on fear, on her ability to control and manipulate. But now, she was up against someone who didn't just have power, she had the law on her side. And it wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about justice. Deborah stood there for what felt like an eternity, completely frozen. The silence was deafening. I could see the gears turning in her head, but she had no idea how to respond. She opened her mouth, trying to say something, but her voice failed her. Finally, she stepped back and motioned to her SUV. "I didn't know," she muttered, her voice shaky. "I didn't know it was you." "It doesn't matter who I am," I snapped back, stepping forward with renewed strength. "What matters is that you just blocked an ambulance. You made a decision that could have cost my mother her life. And for what? To uphold your precious little bylaws." Her mouth opened and closed, but no more words came out. She had no defense. There was no way for her to justify her actions. And deep down, I knew she realized that. But Deborah wasn't just about to back down. She was too used to wielding power without consequence. "You don't understand," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just following the rules. The rules are there for a reason." "The rules almost killed my mother," I shot back, my voice filled with raw emotion. "And your so-called rules are what made you believe that people's lives don't matter." For a split second, I thought she might finally show some humanity, but she didn't. Instead, she just crossed her arms, eyes narrowed, and turned away. "I'll be reporting this," she said in a low voice. And that was when I knew. Deborah wasn't interested in right or wrong. She wasn't interested in helping anyone. She was only interested in enforcing her control, no matter the cost. The ambulance was now on its way, and every second felt like an eternity. I could see my mother's fragile form being carefully loaded into the back of the paramedic's rig. Her lips were still tinged with a blue hue, and her breathing was shallow. But she was alive. I rushed to climb in beside her, my heart still pounding in my chest. "Mom, just hold on. Please stay with me," I whispered, squeezing her hand. The paramedics worked frantically, monitoring her oxygen levels, adjusting the equipment, and doing everything they could to stabilize her. But every second mattered, and I couldn't shake the image of Deborah's SUV blocking the way, wasting those precious moments that could have meant the difference between life and death. The sound of sirens filled the air as we pulled away from the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The battle for my mother's life had just begun. Deborah's power trip had cost us, but it wouldn't be the end. Not for her. As we drove toward the hospital, I glanced over at my mother, still conscious but weak. "Mom, you're going to be okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She managed a weak smile, squeezing my hand. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," she whispered. The weight of it all was overwhelming. But as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, I knew one thing for sure. I would never let anyone, especially someone like Deborah, stand in the way of what truly mattered. The days that followed the incident felt surreal. We were all living in a kind of suspended reality. My mother was stable now, but the storm had only just begun. Word about what had happened spread like wildfire. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip, and people began to pick sides. Some stood with Deborah, defending her so-called rules, while others rallied behind us, outraged at how the HOA president had obstructed a medical emergency. I spent my days on the phone with neighbors, listening to their opinions, their frustrations, and their stories of how Deborah had bullied them in the past. It was like peeling back the layers of a rotten apple. What had seemed like a quiet, peaceful community was actually a battleground for power and control. Deborah's actions had torn the mask off a community that had been hiding its own secrets for far too long. I knew that the real fight wasn't just about what happened to my mother. It was about what Deborah's behavior had revealed. Her disregard for human life wasn't isolated. She had used her position to force out families, manipulate neighbors, and impose her will with little regard for anyone else. And now, the whole neighborhood was beginning to wake up to it. As I looked out the window one morning, I saw my neighbors gathering in small groups, some exchanging knowing glances, others speaking in hushed tones. I could feel the tension in the air. The community was divided, fractured between those who were too afraid to speak out and those who were finally ready to fight back. And in the middle of it all was my mother, recovering in bed, quietly observing, waiting for the right moment to speak. As much as I wanted to just forget the whole ordeal, I knew deep down that I couldn't. Deborah's actions had crossed a line that I couldn't ignore. She had endangered my mother's life, disregarded common decency, and allowed her obsession with rules to override any sense of compassion. I had to do something, but what? My thoughts were clouded with anger, guilt, and a sense of duty. Part of me wanted to file a lawsuit, seek legal action, and make sure Deborah faced the consequences of her actions. But another part of me, my mother's voice inside me, whispered that vengeance wasn't the way forward. Justice, not revenge, she always used to say. But where did justice end, and where did mercy begin? Could I really just let Deborah off the hook? It wasn't until I spoke to my lawyer friend that I found some clarity. You have a case, she said. But remember, it's not just about winning. It's about making sure this never happens again. Her words stuck with me. Justice wasn't just about getting back at Deborah. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever be treated like we had been. So I made the decision. I wasn't going to seek revenge. I was going to fight for change. I wasn't going to let Deborah or anyone else use their power to harm others. And with that, I started preparing the case, not for personal gain, but to make sure this kind of abuse of power could never happen again. My mother, ever the pragmatist, understood the weight of the decision I had made. As much as she wanted to take action against Deborah, she also knew that this wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the next time someone like Deborah came along, they wouldn't have the ability to harm others without consequences. With my mother's support, I began drafting a proposal for new emergency vehicle protocols within the HOA. I wanted to ensure that no one, no matter their position, no matter their power, could stand in the way of people's lives. It wasn't just about medical emergencies. It was about creating a culture of respect, kindness, and accountability in a community that had long been ruled by fear. The more I spoke to my neighbors, the more I realized how important this was. They had been living under Deborah's rule for years, too afraid to speak up. But now they were ready for change. They were ready for justice, and they were willing to fight for it. One evening, while working on the proposal, my phone buzzed with a text from Tom. It's time. We're all in. That's when I realized we weren't just fighting for my mother anymore. We were fighting for the whole community, for every person who had ever been afraid to stand up to Deborah. We were about to turn the page on a new chapter. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. You could feel the energy in the air, the tension, the anticipation. Deborah had been preparing her defense, but I knew that nothing she could say would change the truth. The paramedics had already given sworn statements about the obstruction, and Deborah's actions were indefensible. She could no longer hide behind her title as the HOA president. As I walked into the meeting room, I could feel the eyes of the entire neighborhood on me. Deborah was sitting at the front of the room, her usual smug demeanor gone. She looked pale, almost defeated. The room was packed with people, all eager to hear what would happen next. And there, in the back of the room, was my mother, sitting in a wheelchair, still pale from the ordeal, but with a look of quiet strength on her face. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall, my voice steady as I addressed the crowd. "We've all heard what happened," I began. "We've all seen how Deborah Williams has used her power to control, to manipulate, and to hurt others. But what happened that night wasn't just about me or my mother. It was about each of us." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. Deborah's actions endangered my mother's life, but she's not the only one. She's been hurting this community for years, and we can't let that continue. We deserve better. There was a long silence. Then, one by one, the board members began to speak out, some reluctantly admitting that Deborah's reign had caused more harm than good. The tide was turning. Deborah was losing her grip on power. After hours of heated debate, the vote was called. The outcome was clear. Deborah Williams would be removed from the board, and a new set of protocols would be established, protocols that would ensure no one, regardless of their status, could obstruct medical emergencies again. As the meeting adjourned, my mother and I sat there, overwhelmed by the support of our neighbors. People who had once been silent were now standing with us, ready to make sure that this community would never be ruled by fear again. The change wasn't just about the protocols, though. It was about something much deeper. It was about a shift in the way people saw each other, the way they cared for each other. We had been through a trial by fire, but we had come out stronger, united. And as I looked around at my neighbors, I realized something that I would never forget. Sometimes, change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from the people who decide to stand up, to speak out, and to make a difference, no matter how hard it may be. My mother, despite everything she had gone through, was proud. "You did it," she said, her voice weak but full of pride. "You fought for what was right." And in that moment, I realized that the real power in any community doesn't come from titles or rules. It comes from people who decide to care, to stand up for each other, and to fight for what's just, even when the odds seem impossible. As we left the meeting, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. We had won, not because of any legal victory, but because we had restored the heart of our community. And that, I knew, was a victory that would last a lifetime.